My name is Edna Wilson, 68 years old, and I just lost Richard, my husband of 43 years. While everyone thought I was just a simple housewife, they had no idea about the $18 million inheritance or the skyscraper in New York City registered in my name. The night after the funeral, my daughter-in-law Margaret screamed at me to leave their house, calling me an old leech. I simply said, "Okay." Little did she know what I was about to do next. Before I continue my story, let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like and subscribe button and stick around to see how I turn my tragedy into triumph. My story begins in a small town in Minnesota where I grew up in a modest family. We never had much, but my parents instilled in me the values of hard work and integrity. I was 23 and working as a receptionist at a small property management firm when I first met Richard Wilson. He walked in looking for office space to rent, and there was something about his confident smile and kind eyes that caught my attention immediately. Richard was 30 at the time, ambitious and full of dreams about building a real estate empire. He asked me out for coffee after our third meeting, and within 6 months we were married. Many thought we rushed into things, but when you know, you know. The early years weren't easy. Richard had big ideas, but limited capital. We decided to move to New York City, where opportunities in real estate seemed endless. I supported us by working multiple jobs: receptionist during the day, waitressing at night, and bookkeeping on weekends, while Richard networked and scraped together investors for his first properties. When our son Michael was born 2 years after we married, I cut back on my hours, but still helped with the books for Richard's fledgling company. Those early family years were beautiful, despite the struggles. We lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment, and I remember rocking Michael to sleep while going over rental agreements and property evaluations. Richard's first big break came when he managed to secure a small commercial property in an up-and-coming neighborhood in Brooklyn. He renovated it with mostly his own hands and flipped it for a profit that allowed him to invest in 2 more properties. This was the beginning of Wilson Properties. Over the next decade, Richard's company grew steadily from a small operation to a respectable mid-sized development firm. As the business expanded, I stepped back from my active role to focus on raising Michael, managing our household, and supporting Richard at important business events. I became the silent partner, the foundation that allowed Richard to reach for the stars. Even as the business flourished, Richard was always somewhat secretive about our finances. "Don't worry about the numbers," he would tell me. "I promise you'll always be taken care of." And I trusted him completely. Despite our growing wealth, we maintained a comfortable but not extravagant lifestyle. Richard always said, "Live below your means and invest the difference." He drove the same car for 15 years, and we stayed in the same upgraded but modest house in a nice suburb instead of moving to a mansion. Richard had a philosophy about wealth. "The truly wealthy don't need to flaunt it," he would say. "Flash and cash are for the insecure." I embraced this mindset, finding contentment in simple pleasures rather than luxury goods. On our 25th anniversary, Richard gave me a beautiful emerald necklace. Not flashy, but elegant and timeless. That night, as we danced in our living room after a home-cooked dinner, he whispered, "Edna, you've been my rock through everything. I've made arrangements to make sure you're secure no matter what happens to me." I kissed him and pushed away the thought of ever losing him. How could I know then how significant that promise would become? Throughout those years, I never questioned Richard's decisions or pushed for details about our finances. Perhaps I should have been more involved, but our arrangement worked for us. Richard built the business and I built our home. We were partners in every sense, each with our own domain of responsibility. Looking back, I realized Richard was planning far ahead while I was focused on our day-to-day happiness. Those early decades of our marriage were filled with hard work, but also with joy. Weekend picnics in Central Park with young Michael, summer vacations to the Jersey Shore, and quiet evenings reading together on the porch. We found richness in these simple moments that no amount of money could buy. As Wilson Properties grew to encompass commercial real estate throughout the Northeast, Richard remained grounded. He never forgot where we came from, and neither did I. At charity events where his peers arrived in limousines, we would often drive ourselves in our sensible sedan. This humility was something I cherished about him, never imagining it would one day become a source of contempt from my own family. Our son Michael grew into a handsome, intelligent young man. While he had a kind heart like his father, he developed a sense of entitlement that concerned me. Richard's success meant Michael never knew the struggles we had faced. He attended elite private schools from kindergarten and expected the best of everything. I tried to instill our values in Michael, but it was challenging when his friends all came from wealthy families who displayed their riches openly. Still, Michael and I maintained a close relationship throughout his childhood. I attended every school play, soccer game, and award ceremony. We had special Saturday morning breakfasts where just the two of us would talk about anything and everything. Michael excelled academically and followed in his father's footsteps, studying business at Wharton before joining Wilson Properties. Richard was proud but insisted Michael start from the bottom, learning every aspect of the business. Michael initially embraced this approach, and I thought we had succeeded in raising a son who understood the value of hard work, despite his privileged upbringing. Everything changed 5 years ago when Michael, then 33, met Margaret Lancaster at a charity gala. Margaret came from a good family with old but dwindling money. She was beautiful, polished, and sophisticated in a way I never was. When Michael first introduced us, Margaret was charming and attentive. She asked about my volunteer work at the local literacy program and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. Their courtship was a whirlwind. Within 3 months, Michael proposed with a ring that cost more than our first house. Margaret immediately began planning a wedding that would properly reflect the Wilson name in society, as she put it. I noticed the first red flags during wedding preparations. Margaret vetoed my suggestion of using my mother's handmade lace for part of her veil, calling it quaint but not appropriate for a wedding of this caliber. She was polite about it, but the message was clear: my simple tastes had no place in her world. The wedding was an extravagant affair at the Plaza Hotel with over 400 guests, many of whom neither Richard nor I had ever met. As mother of the groom, I felt strangely out of place, like an extra rather than a key participant. Margaret's mother took center stage, making decisions and overriding my few suggestions with a smile that never reached her eyes. After the honeymoon, I began to see subtle changes in Michael's behavior toward me. Our Saturday breakfast became monthly, then quarterly, then stopped altogether. When I called, he was always just heading into a meeting. Margaret began to subtly criticize my clothes, my home decor, even the way I spoke. "Edna, you really should update your wardrobe if you're going to attend company functions," she would say with a concerned smile. "Those sensible shoes and simple dresses age you unnecessarily." Each comment was framed as helpful advice, making it difficult to object without seeming overly sensitive. When the twins Emma and Ethan were born 2 years after the wedding, I was overjoyed at becoming a grandmother. I expected to be a regular presence in their lives, but Margaret had other ideas. Visits had to be scheduled well in advance, and there were always rules: don't bring sugary treats, don't pick them up too much as it would create dependency issues, don't contradict any of Margaret's parenting approaches. Richard noticed these changes but chose to avoid confrontation. "Let's not rock the boat," he would say. "They're young and figuring out their own way." But I saw the hurt in his eyes when Michael canceled our traditional family Christmas Eve dinner to attend Margaret's family gathering instead. The full extent of Margaret's feelings became clear during a dinner at their lavish mansion in the Hamptons. Richard and I had been invited along with several of Margaret's friends. As I helped clear some plates from the table, I overheard Margaret in the kitchen telling her friend, "Yes, Michael's mother is sweet, but such a frumpy housewife. You can hardly believe she's married to Richard Wilson. No sense of style or social presence at all." I stood frozen, plates in hand, as her friend replied, "Must be difficult for Michael to have her represent the family at events." Margaret laughed lightly. "We limit those occasions as much as possible. Fortunately, she seems content to stay in the background." I quietly set down the plates and returned to the dining room, my face burning with humiliation, but determined not to cause a scene. When Richard asked if I was feeling well, I blamed it on a headache rather than tell him what I had heard. Peace in the family seemed more important than my wounded pride. This pattern continued and worsened over the next 3 years. Michael became increasingly dismissive of my opinions on everything from business to parenting. When I suggested that the twins might enjoy the same children's books Michael had loved, he cut me off with, "Mom, those are outdated. Margaret has researched the most developmentally appropriate literature." At family gatherings, I was increasingly sidelined. Richard remained respected for his business acumen, but I became nearly invisible. Margaret would introduce her parents to new friends, but somehow never quite get around to acknowledging me. Despite this treatment, I treasured the moments I did get with my grandchildren. Emma had Richard's kind eyes, and Ethan had his grandfather's curious mind. During my restricted visits, I would soak up every smile, every question, every hug, knowing such moments were precious and increasingly rare. 2 years ago, Richard received devastating news. His heart was failing. He had been quietly managing heart problems for years, but things had taken a serious turn. The doctors gave him perhaps 2 to 3 years with proper care and medication. Richard, ever the planner, immediately began putting his affairs in order, though we told no one else about his prognosis. One evening, after a doctor's appointment, Richard sat me down in his home office. "Edna, there are things you need to know," he said, his voice steady despite the gravity of our situation. "The company is worth far more than anyone realizes, including Michael." Richard explained that while Wilson Properties was successful and valuable, he had been making separate investments and acquisitions for decades, deliberately keeping them apart from the company books. "I've watched how Margaret influences Michael, how focused they both are on status and appearance. I'm concerned about what will happen to everything I've built." The next week, Richard introduced me to Jonathan Keller, his most trusted lawyer and friend of 30 years. In Jonathan's office, with the door locked and assurances of complete confidentiality, Richard revealed his secret financial arrangements. "The cornerstone is an office tower on Fifth Avenue," Richard explained, showing me documents for a skyscraper I had never heard him mention before. "I purchased it through a separate holding company 15 years ago, and is registered solely in your name, Edna." I stared at him in shock. How is that possible? I never signed anything for a skyscraper. Richard smiled gently. "Remember that anniversary trip to the Bahamas, where we met with that financial advisor and signed a stack of papers? That was part of it. I've been planning this for a long time." Jonathan then showed me statements for multiple investment accounts and trusts totaling over $18 million, all structured to bypass probate and transfer directly to me upon Richard's death. "But why keep this from Michael?" I asked, confused by the secrecy. Richard sighed deeply. "Michael has good qualities, but he's been changed by Margaret and her values. If they knew the full extent of our wealth, I fear it would be squandered on appearances rather than used for lasting good. This way, you'll be protected no matter what happens with the company after I'm gone." Richard had one firm instruction: I was to tell no one about these assets until after his death and the reading of his will. "Not even Michael, especially not Michael," he insisted. "Promise me, Edna." Though uncomfortable with the deception I promised, Richard had always handled our finances, and I trusted his judgment even when I didn't fully understand it. Over the next months, as Richard's health declined, he met regularly with Jonathan, updating his will and ensuring all legal details were properly arranged. The official will would leave Wilson Properties entirely to Michael, which everyone expected, while mentioning that other assets have already been distributed as I have arranged privately. When I expressed anxiety about keeping such secrets, Richard took my hands in his. "Edna, you've trusted me with our financial future for 41 years. Trust me in this final decision. When the time comes, you'll understand, and you'll know what to do." During one of our last meaningful conversations, as Richard rested in our bedroom, after a particularly difficult day, he reminisced about our early years. Remember that first apartment, how the ceiling leaked every time it rained and we had to put pots all over the floor? I laughed through tears. And how we'd name each pot after a famous explorer because they were discovering new territory each time. Richard smiled weakly. Those were some of my happiest days, Edna, when we had nothing but each other. He squeezed my hand. Promise me you'll be strong when the time comes. You're much stronger than you know. I promised, not realizing how soon and how severely that strength would be tested. Richard passed away on a quiet Tuesday morning in our bedroom. Despite knowing it was coming, the loss left me hollow. I sat beside him holding his hand for hours until it grew cold, whispering my love and gratitude for our life together. Eventually, I called Michael, then our family doctor, who confirmed what I already knew. Michael and Margaret arrived at the house within the hour. Michael was visibly shaken while Margaret immediately began taking charge. We need to contact the funeral home, she said, her phone already in hand. And of course you'll need help with all the arrangements, Edna. Don't worry about a thing. There was no space given for my grief. No moment where either of them simply held me or acknowledged that I had just lost my partner of over 4 decades. Instead, Margaret efficiently organized, delegated, and planned, treating Richard's death like an event to be managed rather than a profound loss to be mourned. The funeral arrangements were quickly taken out of my hands. When I suggested a small private service, as Richard would have wanted, Margaret overruled me. Richard Wilson was an important figure in New York real estate. The funeral needs to reflect his stature. What followed was an elaborate event at the city's most prestigious cathedral with hundreds of attendees, many of whom I barely recognized. During the service, I sat quietly in the front row, my simple black dress a stark contrast to Margaret's designer mourning attire. I clutched a private note Richard had left for me to be opened after his death. While Margaret had insisted on writing the official eulogy, I took comfort in Richard's final words to me. Remember your strength. Remember your worth. All that truly matters is already secure. After the service, as people filed past to offer condolences, Margaret's friends and family received more attention than I did. I was introduced as Richard's widow, rather than by name, as though my identity had died along with my husband. Michael, distracted by important business associates attending the service, barely spoke to me throughout the day. 3 days after the funeral came the reading of the will in Jonathan's office. Michael and Margaret arrived looking confident and somewhat impatient. Jonathan nodded respectfully to me before beginning the formal proceedings. As expected, Richard left Wilson Properties entirely to Michael. My son has been prepared to lead this company, and I entrust it to his stewardship. Jonathan read from the will. Margaret squeezed Michael's hand triumphantly. Their satisfaction was palpable until Jonathan reached the final paragraph. All other assets, not specifically mentioned herein, have already been distributed according to my wishes through private arrangements prior to my death. What other assets? Margaret demanded immediately. What does that mean? Jonathan, professional as always, simply replied, Mr. Wilson made certain private arrangements that are not part of this probate process. Those assets are not included in this will because they have already been legally transferred. That's impossible, Michael protested. I oversee all the company finances. There's nothing significant outside of Wilson Properties. Jonathan merely offered a non-committal nod. The will is clear and legally binding as written. Margaret turned to me, eyes narrowed with suspicion. Do you know anything about this, Edna? I thought of the skyscraper, the $18 million, and my promise to Richard. Richard handled our personal finances, I said softly. I trusted his judgment. The meeting ended with Michael and Margaret clearly unsatisfied, but unable to press further. As we left Jonathan's office, Margaret linked her arm through Michael's. We need to discuss living arrangements, she announced. Obviously, Edna shouldn't be alone in that big house. She should move in with us, at least temporarily. The suggestion was framed as concern, but I recognized it for what it was, an attempt to keep me close while they figured out what other assets might exist. Still grieving, and not yet ready for confrontation, I agreed to the arrangement knowing it would be anything but temporary in their minds. Within a week, I had moved into the guest suite of their Hamptons mansion, bringing only clothing and personal mementos. The house where Richard and I had built our life together was put up for sale immediately, despite my protests that it was too soon. "It's just a house, Mom," Michael said dismissively, "and the market is excellent right now." As I arranged my few belongings in the lavishly decorated but impersonal guest room, I realized I had become a guest in my own family, tolerated rather than welcomed, an obligation rather than a loved one. Still, I maintained my silence about Richard's financial arrangements, honoring his wishes and waiting for clarity on when and how to reveal the truth. Life in Michael and Margaret's home quickly proved to be an exercise in restraint and humiliation. What began as temporary arrangements clearly became permanent in their minds, with Margaret establishing rules for my presence in their home, as though I were a child rather than a grieving widow. "We prefer meals to be taken at the scheduled times, Edna," Margaret informed me on my third day there. "And please let the housekeeper know if you'll be joining us so Maria can set the table properly." My movements around the house were subtly restricted. The formal living room was just been redecorated and not for daily use. The kitchen was the domain of their chef, and I should not disturb his workflow. Even the garden had designated hours when I was welcome to use it without interfering with Margaret's entertaining schedule. My relationship with my grandchildren became even more controlled. I could only see Emma and Ethan when their nanny approved, and my suggestions for activities were routinely overruled. When I brought small gifts for them, books or simple toys, Margaret would inspect them first and often declare them not quite right for our parenting approach before they disappeared, never to reach the children. Margaret's criticism of my appearance became more direct. "Edna, those clothes really aren't suitable for someone living in this house," she remarked one morning at breakfast. "People will talk if they see Richard Wilson's widow looking so ordinary. I've scheduled an appointment with my personal shopper." When I explained that I preferred my simple styles and was comfortable as I was, Michael intervened. "Mom, Margaret is just trying to help. Dad's gone now, and it's time for some changes." The message was clear. Without Richard, my preferences no longer mattered. I was expected to be grateful for their generosity in taking me in and to comply with their vision of who I should be. The situation worsened when I discovered Margaret had gone through my personal belongings while I was out for a doctor's appointment. I returned to find my dresser drawer slightly rearranged and my jewelry box not quite as I had left it. When I carefully raised the issue at dinner, Margaret dismissed my concerns. "I was just helping Maria organize your things, Edna. The poor girl can hardly clean properly with everything so cluttered." Michael added, "Mom, don't be paranoid. Margaret is trying to make things nice for you." I fell silent, but the invasion of my privacy left me feeling even more vulnerable and disrespected. A particularly painful incident occurred during a family photo session Margaret had arranged. As the photographer was setting up, Margaret smoothly directed me to stand aside. "We'll do the core family first," she said brightly. "Then we can take a few with Grandma." Those few with Grandma never happened. After an hour of various poses with Michael, Margaret, and the twins, Margaret suddenly remembered an appointment. "We can finish another time," she told the photographer as she ushered the family away, leaving me standing alone in the living room. The final humiliation came during one of Margaret's dinner parties. I had been permitted to attend only after agreeing to wear an outfit Margaret had selected. As I helped serve coffee in the living room after dinner, I overheard Margaret's friend Sylvia whispering, "How long will your mother-in-law be staying? It must be so difficult having her underfoot all the time." Margaret sighed dramatically. "What choice do we have? She has nowhere else to go, and Michael feels responsible. But between us, we're discussing some excellent retirement communities. She'd have peers her own age and appropriate activities." I nearly dropped the coffee pot. They were planning to put me in a home, as though I were incapable of independent living at 68. As though my only value was as a problem to be solved. I retreated to the kitchen, hands shaking, and missed what happened next. But later that evening, as I was reading in my room trying to calm my thoughts, I heard a crash from downstairs. Rushing down, I found Margaret standing over a shattered crystal vase, her face contorted with anger. "Look what happened because the table was moved," she shouted when she saw me. "This was a wedding gift from the mayor." "I'm sorry," I said automatically, though I had nothing to do with the table or the vase. "Can I help clean up?" Something in Margaret snapped. "Help? How could you possibly help? You've been nothing but a burden since you arrived, living off our charity while contributing nothing." Michael entered the room, alarmed by the shouting. "Margaret, calm down, it's just a vase." But Margaret was beyond calming. "No, Michael, it's time for honesty. Your mother has been nothing but dead weight, taking up space, interfering with the children, judging everything while sitting around being useless." "Margaret, please." Michael attempted again, but his tone was weak, his posture submissive. "No." Margaret turned to me, pointing toward the stairs. "Pack your bags. The old leech doesn't stay here another night. I want you gone by morning." I stood perfectly still, absorbing the full force of her hatred. In that moment, I thought of Richard, of his warnings and preparations. I thought of the skyscraper with my name on it, and the $18 million waiting in accounts only I could access. I looked at my son standing there, allowing his wife to abuse his mother, and at Margaret, beautiful and cruel in her designer clothes and perfect makeup. They were waiting for me to cry, to beg, to collapse. Instead, I simply said, "Okay." The single word seemed to confuse them both. Margaret had expected resistance, tears, or apologies. My calm acceptance left her momentarily speechless. I turned and walked upstairs with dignity, closing my bedroom door softly behind me. Only then did I allow tears to fall, not for Margaret's cruelty or even Michael's betrayal, but for Richard. "You were right," I whispered to his memory. "You were right about everything." I knew exactly what I needed to do next. That night, after ensuring the house was quiet, I called Jonathan Keller from my bedroom. Despite the late hour, he answered immediately. "It's time," I said simply. "Can we meet tomorrow morning?" "I've been expecting your call, Jay," he replied. 9 o'clock at Bluebird Cafe. It's discreet." The next morning, I left the house early, taking only my purse and a small overnight bag with essentials. No note, no explanation. Let them wonder. Jonathan was waiting in a private corner of the cafe when I arrived. After ordering coffee, he placed a leather portfolio on the table between us. "Richard prepared everything meticulously," he explained, opening the folder to reveal detailed documents. "Let me walk you through what you now control." The full extent of Richard's secret preparations took my breath away. The skyscraper on Fifth Avenue Wilshire Tower was a 30-story premium office building fully leased to prestigious tenants with an estimated value of over $80 million. As the sole owner, all rental income flowed into accounts in my name. Richard purchased it 15 years ago through a separate holding company when the previous owner faced bankruptcy, Jonathan explained. He kept it entirely separate from Wilson Properties and registered it solely in your name. The investment accounts were equally impressive. A diverse portfolio of stocks, bonds, and mutual funds totaling just over $18 million, structured for both growth and income. "You can comfortably withdraw $400,000 annually without touching the principal," Jonathan noted. "But why didn't Richard tell Michael about any of this?" I asked, still struggling to understand the secrecy. Jonathan's expression grew serious. Richard observed how Margaret's influence changed Michael's values and priorities. He feared that this wealth would be squandered on appearances rather than used meaningfully. He wanted you protected, independent, and able to establish your own legacy. As the reality of my situation sank in, I felt both liberated and overwhelmed. For decades, I had deferred to Richard on financial matters, content in my role as wife and mother. Now, I was a wealthy woman in my own right, with decisions to make and power to wield. "What do you recommend as first steps?" I asked Jonathan. "Secure independent living arrangements immediately," he advised. "I suggest the Plaza Hotel temporarily, while we prepare a more permanent solution." He smiled slightly. "As it happens, there's a beautiful 3-bedroom apartment available on the 25th floor of Wilshire Tower. The previous tenant was relocating last month, and Richard instructed me to hold it vacant just in case." I laughed for what felt like the first time in months. He really did think of everything. Jonathan arranged for a car to take me directly to the Plaza Hotel, where a suite had been reserved in my name. As I settled into the luxurious rooms, I felt a strange mixture of grief and liberation. Richard was gone, but he had ensured I would never be at anyone's mercy. Over the next week, I began rebuilding my life with Jonathan's guidance. I met with financial advisors to understand my investments, better determined to be a wise steward of what Richard had entrusted to me. I hired an interior designer to transform the Wilshire Tower apartment into my dream home. Elegant but comfortable, with a library, a proper kitchen where I could bake for my grandchildren if they ever visited, and a home office where I could manage my new responsibilities. A discreet personal shopper helped me select a new wardrobe, not to meet Margaret's standards of fashion, but to reflect my own taste with quality pieces that made me feel confident. I chose classic styles and fine fabrics, comfortable but elegant, appropriate for the businesswoman I was now becoming. Meanwhile, Michael had been calling frantically, first angry, then confused, finally concerned when none of our mutual friends reported seeing me. I let his calls go to voicemail, not yet ready for that confrontation. I needed time to find my footing in this new reality. I reconnected with friends I had lost touch with during Margaret's reign, women who had known me before I became just Richard's wife or Michael's mother. Over lunches and afternoon teas, I rediscovered parts of myself that had been suppressed for years: my love of art, my interest in social causes, my quiet sense of humor. With Jonathan's encouragement, I began researching charitable foundations. Richard had built his fortune in real estate, and it seemed fitting to use part of that wealth to address housing insecurity. The Richard Wilson Foundation for Affordable Housing began to take shape in my mind, a way to honor his legacy while creating my own. I also sought help processing my grief and family situation. Dr. Lauren Adams, a therapist specializing in late-life transitions, helped me navigate the complex emotions of losing Richard while being rejected by Michael and Margaret. "Your husband gave you financial security," she observed during one session, "but the greater gift may be this opportunity to rediscover yourself." The most difficult realization was accepting that Michael might never change. Margaret's influence ran deep, and his failure to defend me revealed a fundamental weakness in his character. While I would always love him as my son, I could no longer pretend our relationship was healthy or allow myself to be diminished by his choices. As painful as this acknowledgement was, it also brought clarity. I didn't need to win Michael and Margaret's approval or acceptance. I could create a meaningful life without their validation. Richard had given me not just financial resources, but freedom to live authentically, regardless of their opinion. By the time I moved into my newly renovated apartment in Wilshire Tower, 3 weeks after leaving Michael and Margaret's house, I had a clear vision for my future and a plan to address the past. It was time to reveal the truth, not out of vengeance, but as a necessary step toward whatever relationship might be possible with my son going forward. The grand opening of the Richard Wilson Foundation for Affordable Housing was scheduled for exactly 1 month after I left Michael and Margaret's home. I had chosen the impressive lobby of Wilshire Tower as the venue, a space few people knew was actually mine. The invitations went out to leaders in New York, real estate city officials, and nonprofit organizations working to address housing inequity. And of course, to Michael and Margaret Wilson. I knew they would come, if only out of curiosity about where I had been and what I was doing. The invitation offered no explanations, simply announcing the establishment of the foundation in Richard's honor, with a reception to follow the formal announcement. In the weeks leading up to the event, I worked closely with Jonathan and a team of professionals to establish the foundation with an initial endowment of $5 million from my personal funds. We developed grant programs for affordable housing developers, rental assistance initiatives, and educational scholarships for students pursuing careers in community development. On the evening of the event, I arrived early wearing a classic navy blue dress that projected both elegance and authority. The lobby had been transformed with tasteful decorations, catering stations, and a small stage with a podium. A portrait of Richard hung prominently behind the stage, his kind eyes seeming to watch over the proceedings. As guests began to arrive, I stood near the entrance greeting each one personally. Many expressed surprise at seeing me in this role, especially those who knew me only as Richard's quiet wife from charity functions and company events. I enjoyed their confusion knowing greater surprises were yet to come. At precisely 7:30, I spotted Michael and Margaret entering the lobby, looking around with obvious bewilderment. Margaret was impeccably dressed as always, while Michael appeared tired and strained. I approached them directly, my head held high. "Michael, Margaret, thank you for coming," I said calmly, as though our last interaction hadn't ended with Margaret screaming at me to leave their home. "Mom, what is all this?" Michael gestured around at the gathering. "Where have you been?" "We've been worried sick," Margaret added with forced concern. "You just disappeared without a word. It was very inconsiderate." "I had matters to attend to," I replied simply. "Please enjoy some refreshments. The formal presentation will begin shortly." I moved away before they could question me further, greeting other guests and watching from the corner of my eye as they whispered urgently to each other while scanning the room for clues. At 8 o'clock, Jonathan tapped a microphone and introduced me as the founder and president of the Richard Wilson Foundation. As I took the stage, I could see Michael and Margaret's confusion intensifying. "Good evening, and thank you all for coming," I began. "Many of you knew my late husband, Richard Wilson, as a successful developer and businessman. I knew him as a visionary who understood that true wealth lies not in what we accumulate, but in what we contribute. I outlined the mission of the foundation, explaining how it would work to ensure affordable housing remained available in a city where property values continue to soar. And to launch this initiative, I am pleased to announce an initial endowment of $5 million, I continued, as well as dedicated office space here in Wilshire Tower, generously provided by the building's owner. I paused, taking in the attentive faces before me. For those who may not know, Wilshire Tower has been under my personal ownership for the past 15 years. My husband arranged for its purchase and transfer to my name long before his illness as part of his commitment to ensuring my independent financial security. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I saw Michael's jaw literally drop while Margaret's face flushed deep red. "Additionally," I continued, "I am establishing a scholarship program for young women entering real estate development to ensure that future generations have opportunities regardless of background or circumstance." The announcement received enthusiastic applause. As I stepped away from the podium and people moved forward to congratulate me, I could see Michael and Margaret making their way toward me, pushing past other guests. "Is there somewhere we can talk privately?" Michael demanded when they reached me, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. I nodded toward a conference room off the main lobby. "After I've greeted the mayor. 15 minutes. Making them wait was a small but significant assertion of my new reality. I was no longer the overlooked mother-in-law or the grieving widow to be managed. I was Edna Wilson, owner of Wilshire Tower and founder of a multi-million-dollar foundation. When I finally entered the conference room, Michael was pacing while Margaret sat rigidly in a chair, her perfect posture betraying extreme tension. "What the hell is going on, Mom?" Michael burst out. "A skyscraper, $5 million. How long have you been hiding this?" "I haven't been hiding anything," I replied calmly. "Your father made these arrangements years ago, and I honored his wishes by not discussing them until now." "That's impossible," Margaret interjected. "Michael runs the company. He would know about a purchase this significant." "Wilshire Tower was never part of Wilson Properties," I explained. "Your father maintained separate investments outside the company, Margaret. Investments now legally mine." Michael ran his hands through his hair in frustration. Why would Dad do this? Why keep it secret from me? The moment had come for honesty. however painful, because he saw how your priorities were changing. He watched you and Margaret focus increasingly on appearance, status, and material displays while dismissing the values he had built his life around. Michael flinched as if I'd slapped him. That's not fair, isn't it? I countered gently. Look at how quickly you allowed your wife to treat me like an unwelcome burden once your father was gone. Richard saw that coming, Michael. He made sure I would never be at your mercy. Margaret stood suddenly. This is preposterous. We opened our home to you and made it clear every day that I was an imposition, I replied, until you finally ordered me to pack my bags and leave, calling me an old leech. Those were your exact words, Margaret. Michael at least had the grace to look ashamed. Margaret was upset about the vase. She didn't mean it. She absolutely meant it, I corrected him. And you stood by and allowed it. That night confirmed everything your father feared. Margaret's approach suddenly shifted, her voice softening to a conciliatory tone I recognized all too well. Edna, we've all been under such stress since Richard's passing. Grief makes people say and do things they don't mean. Of course, you're always welcome in our home. I nearly laughed at the transparency of her reversal. That's very generous, Margaret, but unnecessary. I'm quite comfortable in my apartment here in the building. The entire 25th floor, in fact. Michael looked devastated while Margaret's calculating eyes suggested she was already revising strategies. So what happens now? He asked. What else did Dad leave that I don't know about? The details of my financial situation are private, I said firmly. What matters is that I am establishing my own legacy, now honoring your father's memory while creating something meaningful for the future. And what about us? Michael's voice cracked slightly. What about your grandchildren? This was the hardest part, but necessary. I will always love you, Michael. You're my son, but our relationship needs to change. I won't be mistreated or marginalized ever again by either of you. If you want me in your life and the children's lives, it will be on terms of mutual respect. And if we don't agree to your terms, Margaret asked coldly, then you'll miss the opportunity to know the real me, and your children will grow up without a grandmother who loves them deeply. I stood, signaling the end of our conversation. I have guests waiting. Take some time to think about what kind of relationship you want going forward. The choice is yours. I left them sitting there, rejoining my event with a lightness I hadn't felt in years. Whatever they decided, I would be okay. Richard had given me financial security, but I had found something even more valuable, my own strength. Over the following months, I settled into my new life with growing confidence. The foundation's work gained recognition, and I found purpose in supporting affordable housing initiatives throughout the city. I made new friends through my philanthropic work, people who appreciated me for my insights and contributions rather than my connection to Richard or Wilson Properties. As for Michael and Margaret, the reconciliation was neither quick nor simple. Margaret initially attempted to publicly discredit me, suggesting to mutual acquaintances that grief had made me unstable. When that failed to gain traction, she shifted to an aggressive charm offensive, sending expensive gifts I promptly donated to charity. Michael struggled with his own conflicted feelings, resentment over his father's lack of trust, anger at being kept in the dark, but also growing awareness of how he had allowed Margaret to mistreat me. 3 months after our confrontation, he came to see me alone without Margaret's knowledge. I've been thinking about what you said, he admitted, sitting uncomfortably in my living room, about how I let things happen. I didn't see it then, but I'm starting to. It was a small beginning, but sincere. We began meeting occasionally for coffee, rebuilding our relationship slowly. 6 months later, Margaret filed for divorce after Michael insisted on rethinking their values and lifestyle. The split was bitter and public, with Margaret demanding an enormous settlement based partly on her assumptions about hidden assets. A year after Richard's death, Michael brought the twins to visit me for the first time in my new home. Emma and Ethan, now 5, were initially shy, but quickly warmed up when they discovered I had created a special playroom just for them, filled with books and simple imaginative toys. Dad used to talk about your Saturday morning breakfast, Michael mentioned as we watched the children play. Do you think we could start something like that with them? The suggestion brought tears to my eyes. I'd like that very much. Today, 2 years after Richard's passing, life has found a new rhythm. The Richard Wilson Foundation has helped fund affordable housing for over 300 families. Michael has returned to the core values his father taught him, running Wilson Properties with integrity while making time for what truly matters. We have Sunday dinners together most weeks, and the twins stay with me one weekend each month. I've discovered joy in my independence, traveling to places Richard and I had always planned to visit, taking art classes, even dating occasionally, though no one could ever replace Richard in my heart. Most importantly, I've found my voice and learned to use it. Richard was right when he said I was stronger than I knew. Sometimes it takes losing everything to discover what you're truly made of. In my case, it took being called an old leech and being thrown out to find the courage to stand tall and claim my rightful place in the world. What would you do if someone tried to make you feel small? Would you accept their judgment, or would you find the strength to redefine yourself on your own terms? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe if this resonated with you, and share with anyone who might need a reminder of their own inner strength. Thank you for listening to my journey, and remember, it's never too late to begin again.